Controversies dealing with human health and government have long existed before the current events. My name is Sherilyn, also known by family and friends as Cheryl. I invite you to follow my personal journey about growing up in Anniston, Alabama, one of the most toxic cities in the United States. My hope is that by sharing this information, it will help awaken the general public so they can see what is being orchestrated before their eyes. We all need to become critical thinkers and stop blindly following other humans just because they hold a title next to their names. I was born in Anniston in 1969. At the time, Monsanto was still producing PCBs, which continued until 1971 when I was 2 years old. My childhood home, up until age 7, was located across Highway 21 from Fort McClellan, which housed the chemical school from 1951 through 1973, and then again in 1979 until Fort McClellan closed in 1999. My family moved to Weaver, Alabama in 1977, less than 4 miles away. Life was simple back then in the southern cities of Anniston and Weaver, Alabama. We didn't have smartphones or video games. The children spent hours each day playing outdoors. We frequented the local creeks, rivers, and lakes to cool down in the summers. Money was tight for many families, so we grew gardens and fish to have plenty to eat. Sadly, none of us were warned by Monsanto or our government, to include the U.S. Army, that all of these normal activities were exposing us to toxins that would later make us sick or lead to death. In 1985, I lost my cousin to leukemia. In 1987, I lost my dear friend and senior classmate to leukemia. By the time I left Anniston in 1987, I was already experiencing several health issues, but I had no idea just how bad things would be later for me or my family and friends. I spoke with my mom about my health just months before I left Anniston in 1987. She assured me that no one feels well all of the time. In the next 15 years, I was blessed with 3 beautiful children. Each year that passed, it became more difficult to sort out whether new symptoms were due to the demands of motherhood or something more. I spent the majority of my adult life thinking everyone feels as horrible as I do, and that is normal. I learned to keep a lot of the struggles to myself to avoid hearing the dreaded words, "No one feels well all of the time." As time passed, one surgery turned into multiple surgeries. A few symptoms multiplied into many symptoms. Allergic reactions turned into hospitalization. On and on this cycle continued. And the older I got, the more difficult it became to hide all of my struggles. It would be several more years before I finally got some answers. In 2007, I married my soulmate. I was excited to become a military wife and looking forward to all the adventures ahead as a family. But life was about to take some crazy turns. My health was about to drastically decline. I would later find out that the military our family had served was partly responsible for making me and many others from my hometown of Anniston so sick. Soon after the wedding, we left Fort Campbell and headed to Fort Gordon, Georgia. Within 4 months, I began having daily migraines. I wasn't familiar with TRICARE insurance, but we were about to become closely acquainted. My migraines traveled with us to Fort Hood, Texas, and by this time, chronic insomnia had set in. Bedtime was no longer my friend. Nothing could have prepared me for the onslaught of health issues that followed. I began having tremors on my right side. My voice would disappear and reappear again. My whole body was taken over by a deep bone pain to this day I cannot adequately describe. My skin hurt. Even getting a shower was painful. And without notice, my muscles started failing me. Looking back, the whole situation felt like we were living in a horror film, with each scene escalating into deeper chaos. My body was turning against itself, and I wasn't sure it was ever going to stop. Finally, after all the years of struggling and wondering, I had some answers. Many diagnoses later, I was given a title that I never asked for: legally disabled. It is very important to me to take this opportunity to thank all the men and women who are currently serving in the U.S. military and those who have served in the past. Your sacrifices for our freedoms and for our country are something to be greatly admired. It breaks my heart to see some of the ways you were treated in the past and to some degree even today. Do not let anyone ever make you question your value and your worth. I salute you. Fort McClellan was established in 1917 and named in honor of Major General George B. McClellan. It was redesignated Fort McClellan in 1929. Thousands of men were trained for World War I and World War II on these grounds. In 1951, the Chemical Corps was activated at Fort McClellan. The Women's Army Corps was established in 1954. In 1975, the U.S. Army Military Police School moved to Fort McClellan. In 1979, the U.S. Army Chemical School was reestablished at Fort McClellan. The Department of Defense's decision to consolidate training for all branches of the service brought U.S. Army, Navy, Marine, and Air Force chemical officers and non-commissioned officers, military police, civilian law officers, and various government agencies to Fort McClellan for training. The addition of the Department of Defense's Polygraph Institute resulted in Fort McClellan becoming an important hub for all aspects of law enforcement training. The sad events that surrounded Fort McClellan's closing in 1999 cannot negate its rich history. As with any story, there is always the good and the bad. Along with the glory days of Fort McClellan and the Anniston Army Depot, there existed some dark and evil deeds. It would be many years before these deeds would be brought fully into the light. The actions of the U.S. Army contaminated the land they used on multiple levels. In the end, some of the land was so contaminated it is no longer usable by the Anniston residents. Just like many others that left the area of Anniston years ago, I wasn't aware of the events taking place in the 1990s and forward. I knew in my heart that my health issues had everything to do with the environment I grew up in Anniston. I began searching for information in 2010 after many diagnoses. I quickly discovered the answers to many of my questions in my hometown newspaper, the Anniston Star. I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to each staff member that has contributed to the Anniston Star through the years. Thank you for sharing important truths when truth hasn't always been popular. The extensive list of chemicals that were stored and used at Fort McClellan makes it appear, at least on paper, more like a chemical lab than a military base. Large amounts of very powerful herbicides and pesticides were used across the fort. Fort McClellan maintained a stock of DDT in 1977. The use of DDT had been banned in 1972. Biological stimulants were used in open airfield tests from 1952 until 1962. In 1975, the U.S. Army moved the military police school to Fort McClellan and began using some of the old chemical school buildings for classrooms and the MP Museum. Later, several U.S. Army reports indicate that cesium-137 and cobalt-60 contamination above the guideline limits was discovered in and around the buildings, as well as the storm drains and sewers. MP barracks were constructed adjacent to the T6 Cane Creek training area. Later, several U.S. Army reports indicate that cesium-137 and cobalt-60 were detected in several areas across the training area. A toxic plume was found in the groundwater underneath the former training area. A toxic plume was detected in the groundwater underneath Landfill 3, which had spread off base. The greatest distribution of contaminants was found within the median of Alabama Highway 21. At least 5 mustard gas spills had occurred across Fort McClellan. Myrex, a toxic organic compound used as an insecticide, was sprayed overhead across Fort McClellan multiple times. Radioactive isotopes were discovered at Rideout Field in 1985, 1995, and 2002.
I will give you a categorical, complete statement that every round of toxic chemical munitions stored on Okinawa has now been removed. The last of them are on that ship right there.
Then it came out that many thousands of nerve gas rockets in the United States were leaking. Over the years, the corrosive chemicals inside the 6-foot-long rocket had eaten through the aluminum casing. Each warhead contained nearly 11 pounds of GB. It was decided to bury the leaking rockets in concrete vaults, which the Army called coffins. Army cameramen took this film in 1967 at Anniston, Alabama Army Depot as the coffins were prepared for shipment to the East Coast. In complete secrecy, the coffins were taken to Earl, New Jersey, just 40 miles from Midtown Manhattan. In 1967 and 68, more than 50,000 nerve gas rockets were dumped in the ocean, 135 miles off the Jersey shore. Then in 1968, after the sheep episode, word got out that more leaking rockets embedded in concrete were to be shipped from Lexington, Kentucky and Anniston, Alabama. This time there were 418 coffins to bury at sea, and public outrage was great. 2 trainloads of nerve gas coffins headed for Sunny Point, North Carolina. No one knew that scientists had told the Army they could not guarantee the safety of the coffins after August 1st, 1970.
After reading through hundreds of pages of articles and reports about Fort McClellan, certain instances stood out more than others to me. In October 2001, a hot spot was observed during a flyover survey. The parcel of land where the hot spot was discovered was formerly part of Fort McClellan, but had been deeded to the city of Anniston in 1976. A soil sample was obtained 6 inches deep near the roots of a tree. The sample contained cobalt-60 and cesium-137. This area was formerly named Lagarde Park. I visited this area many times while living in Anniston and Weaver. In declassified government documents, it became public knowledge that the CIA tested LSD on advanced officers in field training at some point between 1955 and 1967 at Fort McClellan. Former Landfill 1 had not been adequately documented. It was an active landfill from 1945 to 1947. Later, in 1958, officer quarters were built near the landfill area. Building 3335 was built partially on top of the landfill. Building 3337 was built with the backyard meeting the edge of Landfill 1. In 1995, soil samples, surface water samples, and groundwater samples were collected. Lead, arsenic, several volatile organic compounds, several semi-volatile organic compounds, and explosive compounds were found in the samples. While the TCE plume originating from underneath the Anniston Army Depot is the largest, another TCE plume originated from underneath Fort McClellan. The plumes of TCE were intermingling in the groundwater. After analyzing the soil and water sample reports available for Fort McClellan and Pelham Range, it became obvious that TCE appeared all over the grounds of the fort and the range. More interesting, though, is that TCE, PCE, benzene, and vinyl chloride appeared in combination all over the place. When the locations are mapped out on a screen, it looks like a Christmas tree being lit up. On the VA website, the Camp Lejeune Families Act of 2012 is listed. The VA has established presumptive service connection for contaminants in the water supply. The 4 chemicals of interest are PCE, TCE, benzene, and vinyl chloride. Service dates for consideration are August 1st, 1953 through December 31st, 1987. Consideration dates are over a 30-year span of time, with only a 30 accumulative days needed for the minimum requirement. Astonishingly, the VA does not list any presumptive service connections to date for Fort McClellan despite endless supportive data. A Fort McClellan Health Registry Act, H.R. 3666, was introduced to Congress in 2017, but unfortunately made little progress. To the many veterans that served time at Fort McClellan, don't give up. Don't stop fighting this battle. I've stumbled across an excellent resource that I feel will be helpful for you in filing a VA disability claim. I am adding a link to the book below in my description. It breaks my heart to see so many veterans needing help that were stationed at Fort McClellan. The pain and anguish is so visible on their faces and in their voices. It angers me that their cries for help have relatively gone unacknowledged by our government. This can't be allowed to continue. Remember the code of honor? Embrace it. The battle isn't over. It has just begun. We haven't forgotten, and we aren't going anywhere. It's not something I really wanted to do, but I knew I needed to. I needed to face Fort McClellan one more time, now armed with the truth. Turning onto Summerall Gate Road felt comparable to taking a trip to a destination you once admired as a child, and the dread of seeing it as an adult, all broken down and scattered into pieces. I had driven across the grounds in 2007 when it looked much worse, but this time it was personal. I came with eyes fully opened and the reality that Fort McClellan played a part in destroying my hometown. I thought about all of the veterans and their families, all of the civilians that once kept the fort going. I thought about those who were suffering now because no one valued life enough to keep track of all the waste and toxins. The luster is gone. The shine is gone. A phrase kept going through my mind over and over again. You can't polish a turd. To fully understand the gravity of what happened in Anniston, Alabama, one has to see what was lost. Anniston was the first city in Alabama to be lighted with electricity in 1882. Telephones were available as early as 1884. Anniston originated as a planned private community. In the beginning, the city streets were laid out in a perfect checkerboard fashion. In 1883, Anniston was opened to the public. The Atlanta Constitution editor Henry Grady dubbed Anniston the model city of the New South.
Imagine a place so saturated with toxic, cancer-causing chemicals that it's in the dirt people walk on, the air they breathe, even the blood that pumps through their veins. The 24,000 people in Anniston, Alabama don't have to imagine this. Many of them are living it. In fact, they have been living it for decades. They just didn't know about it. The company responsible didn't tell them, and neither did the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency.
There's no question but what this is the most contaminated site in the U.S.
Dr. David Carpenter is a professor of environmental health at the State University of New York in Albany. Dr. Carpenter says PCB exposure increases the risk of almost all major diseases, including cancer, heart disease, and diabetes.
Once again, I turned to my hometown newspaper, the Anniston Star, for information and the truth. When I started my research on Monsanto years ago, I was astonished at the level of evil that had taken place with this corporation. I've always known evil exists in the world, but I had never been on the receiving end of something this orchestrated. Monsanto had been aware since the 1930s that aerochors and PCBs are highly toxic compounds. In 1966, Monsanto contracted with a professor of zoology from Mississippi State University to test fish in the streams polluted by wastewater from the Anniston Monsanto plant. The 1966 report stated that outflow to Snow Creek from the east side of the Monsanto plant contains some extremely toxic materials and kills fish in less than 24 hours when diluted 300 times. The results of the investigation dated November 2, 1966 were reported to Monsanto. In 1969, as more information became public about the dangers of PCBs, the Monsanto PCB Committee considered its options. Among the options listed, sell the hell out of them as long as we can. Alabama's own Secretary of the Alabama Water Improvement Commission states, "We will try to handle the problem quietly without release of the information at this time. Documents prepared by an attorney with anticipation of litigation showed that between the years of 1929 and 1971, almost 680 million pounds of aerochlors were produced at the Anniston Monsanto plant.
But the residents of Anniston aren't just angry with Monsanto, they're also angry with the EPA, which had been aware of the contamination since the 1970s and never warned the community either. Stan Myberg is the EPA's Deputy Regional Administrator for the Southeast. How could the EPA know that this pollution and contamination existed and not alert the people in the community? We have a 1987 draft report. It's just a draft, not a final copy, ordering Monsanto to determine the extent of the problem in Anniston and take corrective action. Whatever happened to that?
What happened was that order was not issued.
Because?
I do not know.
This is 15 years ago. And this office knew 15 years ago that there were PCBs in some of the creeks, that they were in the fish, and that people were eating that fish.
I don't believe I could find better statements to describe the frustration of the situation in Anniston, Alabama than those of former Senator Barbara Mikulski, Senator Richard Shelby, and Anniston resident David Baker Sr. Barbara Mikulski states, "They have tried to get help to get it cleaned up. They went to the state, to the EPA. Nothing was done." She acknowledged the recusals of EPA officials in the Anniston case. She stated, "I honor the legal recusing, but it means that we have essentially appointed somebody to head Region 4 that cannot do anything about Anniston. Then the deputy helper to Administrator Whitman is also recused because they worked for Monsanto." Well, this is just loaded with conflict of interest here. Senator Mikulski hit the nail on the head with this statement. EPA knew about this. EPA was involved with the highest level of the legal community in Alabama and the legal enforcement in terms of the Attorney General, who himself asked for help on Snow Creek. Nothing. Nothing. Senator Richard Shelby stated, "I do not believe that everything has been done to protect their health and well-being. In fact, I am fairly certain that many of these agencies were at the very least complacent in their dealings with Monsanto. The Alabama Water Improvement Commission took no action in 1969. In fact, they encouraged Monsanto to keep the pollution quiet due to a reluctance to inform the public, which would require the issuance of a fish advisory." Senator Shelby summed it up. No one monitored EPA's activities, no one monitored ADEM's activities, and most importantly, no one monitored Monsanto's activities. Statement of David Baker Sr., President of Community Against Pollution in Anniston, Alabama in 2002. "The people of Anniston, Alabama have waited for more than 40 years for the federal government to step in and help us clean up the PCB contaminants in our backyards and in our playgrounds, our rivers, our creeks, and in our bodies. Unfortunately, after 40 years of waiting, I am here today to report that the federal government has failed the people of Anniston and left the fox guarding the henhouse. This company that I speak about today and this problem that I speak about today, when you find that it is a bailout after knowing that all these years that people knew and did nothing about it, hardens my heart. It is obvious that they thought that this could continue and no one would pay any attention to the problem. This is why we are here today. It is not because of an oil spill that was off the shores of the Gulf. This is about someone deceiving the community. I admire the intelligence, strength, and perseverance of the people of West Anniston. I am so proud of you. You stood up for justice against a giant when no one else had the guts to. As if the damage Monsanto did in Anniston, Alabama isn't enough, a quick search on the internet reveals how extensive the damage has been for many years by this corporation worldwide. The U.S. government allowed this corporation to basically take over our food production, while at the same time allow them to manufacture a poison, glyphosate, to kill weeds, which is later detected in the food sources. Who are these people? What kind of government allows this? Better yet, why have we allowed this? It's sad but true. Many families in Anniston, Alabama have been living with contamination for decades, and no one really knew about it until the 1990s. While doing my research about Monsanto, I discovered my great-grandparents lived less than a mile away from the plant for over a decade. In fact, they were living less than a mile away when PCBs were first produced in 1929. I was born less than 2 miles from the Monsanto plant in 1969. I attended the first 2 years of school less than 2 miles from Monsanto. I also discovered my other great-granddad had been a carpenter and helped build parts of Fort McClellan. I lived the first 7 years of my life in a house less than 200 feet from Fort McClellan. My grandparents lived less than 150 feet from Fort McClellan's boundary. Every road leads somewhere. For my family in Anniston, Alabama, those roads were seemingly connected, and there was no getting away from the contamination. This is the most difficult part for me to record in my documentary. There is no way I could consider this journey complete without acknowledging my fellow Bearcats. I've seen and heard about the health struggles many of you have dealt with over the years, much like my own. I've heard about the loss of lives most likely due to the toxins we all experienced through the years. I want to say, I'm sorry, so incredibly sorry. If I could, I would change what happened in our hometown. I know you would too. A picture truly is worth 1,000 words. Here we are, my family, time-stamped in Anniston's history. We were average Americans going about our lives and business, oblivious to the events soon to unfold in our city. What are the odds that I would discover the pictures of my dad and granddad fishing at Logan Martin Lake in 1966 and 1969? My family and Fort McClellan were so interwoven that the fort appears as the backdrop in many family pictures. Sometimes, when I think long and hard, I'm there again, sitting on the front porch, glaring across the highway at the fort, and watching the traffic pass by. We see that a Monsanto spinoff took place in 1997 and the chemical operations became known as Lunacy. In 1999, Pharmacia, Upjohn, and Monsanto settled on a merger agreement. Then, in 2003, Pfizer buys Pharmacia for $60 billion. Looking ahead to 2014, Pfizer is found guilty in the largest healthcare fraud settlement in history. In 2021, we see our government agency, the FDA, working with Pfizer to ask the court for 55 years to fully release data on a highly experimental substance. My whole life, I've heard the phrases follow the paper trail, follow the money trail. In the case of Monsanto, the spinoff, merger, and acquisitions clearly demonstrate the meaning of these phrases. When I contrast the events that took place in Anniston, Alabama all those years ago against the events of the past 2 years in the United States, there are unmistakable parallels in the two stories. In Anniston, as a majority, we put too much trust in these people, and these people, and to some degree, these people. Most of us didn't ask enough questions and demand answers. Do you see now? There is a reason they wanted to wait 55 years to show you the data. After 5 decades passed, the damage would be done. There would be no interventions. What we really needed in Anniston was wisdom. In the end, that's exactly what the residents of West Anniston possessed. This principle is easily applied to current events. If we seek true wisdom, which comes from God, we will be able to separate the good from the evil, who we can trust. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. We need God to keep a sound mind, and we need His wisdom. You won't find true wisdom among fools. If we are following what the world is choosing, that is a good indicator that we are on the wrong path. Just remember, there is a battle in this world for your soul. Don't let anyone capture you with empty philosophies and high-sounding nonsense that come from human thinking and from the spiritual powers of this world rather than from Christ. I leave you with pictures of Anniston and Fort McClellan that demonstrates how greed and deceit stripped the landscape of my hometown.